But we're focusing here today on setting the standards for operational excellence in living sectors, and then whether Build to Rent does set different standards that we can all learn from. So we've got a great panel to talk about that. We'll, as other panels have done, we'll skip introductions in detail. But just to set the scene here, we've got a sector here which has grown dramatically over the last 10 years. We've got over 130,000 homes in operation already. So there's a lot of learning that we've got from this sector already. That's translating into things like a code of practice and a customer charter that we're able to roll out to really differentiate the build-to-rent sector from the wider private rental sector. And that's the important thing we want to get into today. But enough from me. I'm going to open it up with a question to the whole panel to answer. And what would be the single most impactful innovation or operational philosophy from build to rent that you could see as translating or transferring as a blueprint to enhance value and resident satisfaction in other living sectors? So if I can pitch that to you first, Jill.
Yeah, so I mean, Build to Rent has been existing for a while, and I think over the years, a lot of new innovations has been happening. To me, sort of one thing that's transferable to other operational real estate, which I would probably describe it as service-led data fed, because obviously, real estate is all about what the customer needs, and based on that, you can provide a differentiated service offering to drive additional income. And to me, that has always been one of the things that has, been quite an interesting area of Build to Rent, because you're so close to individual customers where you can really learn and gain different insights from them. But then, not every idea works, and that's where kind of the data point really comes in. Once you have an idea and that service-led, that has got customer traction, what I have found that to be validated by data on operational and financial metrics really enable this to be something that can be ingrained into the wider business model. And I think that could be something that could be transferable to other sectors as well.
I know, Helen, you want to talk about data as well, I guess. So could you just elucidate about that a bit more on that?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, it's about really understanding and accepting that we can't just use anecdote to judge renter experience. I think we're close to our teams, we've recruited them, we like them, they're nice to us because we're the investors when we walk in the building, and we kind of assume that everyone else has that same experience. So the importance of the data points, and to your point, there are multiple data points now. Some of them, in terms of things like home views, come to us without us asking for them, and there are other data points that we can go out and get. And it's really important that we're using that data to make the decisions as opposed to just relying on assumptions and snapshots that we see when we happen to be in the building.
Yeah, okay. Ashley, what would be your take on that?
I think from our perspective, when you look at the fruits of various people's labour on the projects that are stabilised now, and you go around, particularly things that are on the market, not necessarily maybe you're doing a secret shopper or whatever, to Helen's point, I think you look at what has been specified and operated over the course of 7 years at the end of a lot of the assets' first life cycle, clearly been particularly interesting to Helen and her wider team in terms of you can see the quality of things and what's actually the areas where people can look for value, because there's a lot of value-add capital looking to enter sort of stabilized schemes at the moment. But I think that it shows the value of integration, because I think that the way operations has been done on a lot of schemes to date has been fairly horizontally disorganized as opposed to vertically integrated. So that's a pretty key priority for, I think, everyone to reorganize themselves and get closer to the assets.
Yeah, and Charlie, you're coming from maybe a different angle slightly, because you're working in the co-living space, a fast emerging subsector of build to rent. What are you seeing as the residential experience and the learnings you're seeing?
Yeah, so something that I think co-living slightly differs with build to rent, but we very much see co-living as kind of subsector to build to rent is, I think in terms of the branding and the positioning, it's really made to feel kind of aspirational and sort of lifestyle led.
Yeah.
And that's obviously kind of somewhat looking at the hotel sector, and you're seeing a lot of that in build to rent over the last couple of years in terms of the customer experience and how you kind of position the product. And I think that that has, as more kind of innovative entrepreneurs and developers have come into the space and pushed their funders to try and be unique and differentiate, you've seen some really interesting concepts and design-led schemes which really think about the end user and how you activate the spaces and the values that you integrate within the brand and position to your residents. So I think that's been really exciting, and obviously again has been somewhat kind of looking at how the hotel has done that effectively. But I think if you look at certainly the student living sector, I think that often can be overlooked, and it's a different price point, but I still think that you can still make students, a lot of students that I look at just think, wow, what an opportunity there to kind of refresh not just the visual identity, but what is the overall experience, and even more so as an opportunity area, and something that at Reshape we're really focused on is senior living.
Sure.
Because that just does not feel aspirational, or I think there's just not that many people that are doing it with a kind of lifestyle led approach, and at the moment it feels like a bit of a taboo for seniors to go into that kind of accommodation, whereas if you can make it really exciting and aspirational, I think there's a big opportunity.
That's right. We'll certainly come back and talk about co-living in more detail later. And yes, we are seeing more in the later living world where rental is becoming a real thing as well, and investors are looking at that. If I can move on back to you, Ashley, and talk about as Apache Capital, you're on the panel here, the group that's really got the biggest scale going, shall I say here. So what would be, you say, the critical success factors, and conversely, the biggest execution risks when developing build-to-rent at scale today? And if you could look at first multifamily, and then maybe touch on to single family as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you that might not be familiar, Apache's been in the build-to-rent space for about 10 years now. And I think the reality is we've been at the sort of larger scale schemes, so we've been funding and involved in asset management of the operations with prime schemes in the regional cities. And if you look at the challenges that have come with that, clearly diversified geographically, so you have to get to know your kind of local market. And ultimately, they've been quite pioneering in terms of price point in a lot of these cities. And I think that's one of the other sort of learnings that we've sort of come to be able to persuade those come on the journey with us in the various cities that we now operate. I mean, I think the pivotal thing is how close you are to your operations team and how close you are to understanding the kind of local market dynamics. We've got some cities that have been very well supplied, such as Leeds. I think people are very closely monitoring the kind of supply in that particular city. But I think the reality is there, in terms of competitiveness, everyone is now seeing the sort of challenges in delivery, but I think the supply will be well absorbed in due course. And so sort of pivoting and taking a lot of our lessons into our Present Made first scheme out in Cambridge. So we've opened that earlier this year, so that's a mix of housing and apartments. And very much the kind of core focus on that is a very tight-knit internal in-house team, and we employ site staff directly. And I think the reality is that closeness to the asset, not necessarily seeing all the different layers from investor through AM to ops, I think is a really critical part of it. And I think the other thing to be sort of cognizant of is to Helen's point around the customer. You're still generally, particularly in new markets, you're still selling to a very uninitiated audience, and I think that's a pivotal part of all of everyone's view of BTR. It's still generally you're not sort of pulling people away from competitor buildings just yet, although there are a few kind of incentives to do so. So I think the kind of lessons learned there is ultimately the phasing, the customer experience on larger scale projects, I think is a critical part of that. We've got about a year gap between first occupation and final occupation on that scheme. So we're seeing that play out in our multifamily as well, where we're doing some larger kind of multi-phase projects. And you have to be very cognizant of some of the challenges that come with that. So it's not just a standalone tower that you kind of get handed the keys and get going. It's a little bit more complicated than that.
That's interesting. Thank you for that. Jill, can I move to you, because obviously you've got a very distinct vision with your business. Could you share really what specific market opportunities and underserved niches that you can see within Build to Rent? And in particular, how does that translate into site selection, design, and development?
Sure. So I guess True North was founded 3.5 years ago with an idea that ultimately the real shortage of the market is mid-market in really dense urban cities like London. So what we are trying to do is create attainable living for people who are making mid-income, which what we call is sort of like the average salary of the city, which in London it's 35, 40K, to call it 75, 80K, right? So that is the part of the market that's been really historically difficult to be served with new product, because build to rent, new build, construction costs, land prices makes this a rather inaccessible market. And this is also not in the realm of affordable housing, social housing. So there's actually a really large mid area of the market that doesn't have any new product. So they end up being in rather sub-quality and outdated housing supply that is not configured for the modern living. And True North is very much hoping to create this, what we call, flex living, and it borders into BTR, co-living. We're not too concerned about what the name is, but it's to create a high quality product that is rather dense, but is community oriented, that enable a mindful and community-centric living for the people in cities like London. So our sites, we currently have 6 sites, and they are ranging from Zone 1 to Zone 4. Obviously, the Zone 4 price point will be different to a Zone 1, but at the same time, each serves the market because there are actually a lot of people, if you think about it, the pyramid, as an income, the mid-market is actually really significant and is actually the biggest private market addressable demand that we could do from a real estate perspective. So we see this as a hugely underserved market, and we are certainly not the only one trying to target it, but so far we haven't seen a scale institutional capital finding really good solution for it. So we're backed by life insurance capital, which is long-term, and ultimately we believe this type of living product deserves long-term institutional capital sources that sees the potential on the development profit, but also the possibility of just leveraging the income in the long run. So I think your other question is on site selection and design. So it's all very much focused on what we were targeting as this end customer experience that we want to create. So these are the young professionals of London. They are the key workers. Some of the grad students as well, but also we have had residents who are in older age bracket, because as long as you live by yourself in London, actually space tends not to be the biggest consideration, but rather quality, ease of commute, how well is your actual living environment, how easy it is your process dealing with any potential living issues, like, because anything happens, we deal with homes. So the ease of dealing with it as opposed to kind of dealing with a private landlord, these are much more of the consideration. I mean, it's different when you have a family, but when you're on your own, and in a place like London, over a third of the population basically live on their own. So there's a pretty huge addressable market for this. So for us, we focus on sites that are in London, very easily commutable to key employment hubs, in locations that we would think that is a safe and comfortable place to live. But these places exist in Zone 1, so we have assets in City of London, we have assets in Holborn, so like very central location targeting, city workers, targeting people who are rather on, have really good jobs, but but then the Zone 4, Zone 2, Zone 3 location creates a much more peaceful and tranquil location, but that still serves a rather big range of income. And the design is very much focused on that as well.
Okay, great. So that's interesting, because that links pretty well now to what I'm going to ask to Charlie, because it's about that. There's Jill mentioned there, people living on their own, but moving into co-living, that's serving another market, the people who want to rent, but necessarily when living in a different way, I guess. So from your point of view, Charlie, what unique operational challenges and opportunities does your model present compared to traditional build to rent? And what sort of audiences are you looking to attract?
So going back to my previous point that I made, I think co-living has gone through a bit of an evolution over the last couple of years, and what's been exciting is actually to see how, in terms of how these operational assets are starting to perform, is that it's slightly surprised investors in terms of how these schemes are operated in the income profiles, and they're starting to see it more to sit in line in a subsector to build to rent. And that's really driven by the length of stays that you're starting to see from sort of 12 to 15 months. At an occupational, in terms of the occupancies of these assets, you're seeing really high performance up to sort of 95 to 97%, leasing up within sort of 3 to 6 months. So historically, yields for co-living have sat more in line with student, and from recent discussions I've been having with developers and investors, they are starting to see that shift more in line with build to rent. I think operationally, there are some nuances where you would perceive co-living to be a bit more operationally intensive, and I think that's predominantly driven by the fact that there's more share spaces, which requires more active management. Yeah. And so in terms of how you resource the activation of those spaces, it does need dedicated focus. And in terms of the length of stays, for kind of traditional sui generis co-living, you'll see length of stays from sort of 3 to 12 months. But as I said, we are seeing a lot of these schemes actually, sort of average length of stays go well up to sort of 12 to 15 months, so not shy of build to rent. But certainly, in terms of those shorter term stays, there is more active management in terms of onboarding and offboarding.
Yeah. And then build to rent in its broader sense is seen as highly amenitized in its early days. How are you dealing with that? What sort of level of amenity you're looking to serve your customers with?
So I think it's amenity provision within co-living has been quite open-ended and driven really by kind of planning. And what certain councils are supportive of. The policy is now much clearer, and generally, kind of the expectation now is to provide around kind of 3 to 4 square meters for sui generis co-living. Sort of first generation co-living assets, I think, slightly over provided, up to sort of 4 or 5 square meters of amenity per person, and if you walk around those schemes, they can feel quite empty and cold at times, particularly during the day. So 3 square meters feels about right. I think there's an argument in more central zones 1 locations to have less amenity, to be perfectly honest. If you've got gyms or cafes nearby, then it doesn't feel sort of necessary to provide. Yeah. But I think around 3 square meters, and then in terms of for us, a big focus is trying to double down on those really in-demand spaces, such as co-working. Obviously, people working from home a lot more. So we'll, our scheme at ARC, we have sort of quiet co-working, we have open public co-working, we have co-working on the ground and on the rooftop, we have private bookable meeting rooms, you have sort of small pod rooms where you can go in if you've got Teams call. So really trying to elevate that experience, and then sort of health and well-being. So having a really strong gym facility is always really positive, and we've got Peloton Spin Studio, and we're in our future schemes kind of looking to evolve on that. Okay, thank you. So if we can move now and deep dive into operations, Helen, given your deeper experience here, what would you say is the common operational blind spots that you could see, and maybe missed opportunities that you often see in build to rent schemes, and really we want to share this with this investor audience?
I mean, it sounds fairly obvious, but when we sit in an office and we look at a spreadsheet or we look at a potential deal, it's really easy to forget that resi and build to rent in particular is so different from other asset classes. They're people having babies, having birthday parties, grieving loved ones. It's such a different asset class. And I think it's really important that from a service perspective, we always start in terms of our team's training and all of our decisions from that point, because it's very easy to make a decision in isolation that is perhaps opening up an amenity space to the public to drive some additional revenue, or allowing the building to be used for filming, or even something really small like putting a load of official signs up all over a lift. Actually, if we start from the perspective that these are homes and these are people's lives that we're engaged in, we make those decisions very differently, which drives that resident satisfaction much more strongly.
Okay. Opening it out and looking forward, I guess it's a question for all of you in one way or another. With how is the increasing cost of capital and ongoing build cost inflation impacting build-to-rent developments moving forward? And what other headwinds do we see? Maybe I'll throw that to you, Ashley, first, for shortish answers, please.
I mean, I think that the reality is you're always competing against other opportunities, right? So there's quite a lot of focus that the capital that might have been invested into ground up development that is now pivoting into acquiring built stock. I think that's a big trend. We've already been seeing that in the last sort of year, 18 months. I think that's the natural evolution point if you look at where there was a sort of big lump of supply. So I think broadly speaking, you're getting sort of very similar returns that people would have been targeting for ground up development and you're able to get that accessing of higher yielding than perhaps people thought would be possible in where the market's kind of trending. I think in terms of the new ground up sort of scheme design and that kind of stuff, to be honest, when we're looking at new opportunities, particularly in London, there's a big focus for us and me personally on the multifamily side, and I can kind of touch on single family as well, which is not my particular focus, but my colleague runs that. We're increasingly looking at, frankly, a very challenging sales market for a lot of the house builders, and that does initiate some good opportunities. Particularly sort of a fairly decent spread between open market value and where the kind of BTR value would be. But in that, you've got some more technical considerations that come with that as well. So there might not necessarily be perfect assets and certainly not necessarily purpose-built rental. So that requires some tweaks to it. But yeah, I think that, to be honest, with the cost of capital and the cost of and holding costs and debt costs, to be honest, it's a big opportunity for the stabilized sector to increasingly get competitive bids for large scale assets, which is broadly what's happening.
And Jill, are you seeing any headwinds or challenges, and how are you overcoming those?
So I guess, we're talking about investor return. For me, return is always strategy plus execution. Right, so because ultimately, yes, cost of capital expectations going up, and so there's really two ways. It's like strategy and execution. Like I think the BTR as a strategy has a lot of actually tailwind for it. That clearly is continuously in demand in particularly major cities like London. In some more regional cities, as Ash was referring to, maybe there is a bit more of a supply-demand balance, but a place like London, as long as you can build, you can lease them, right? So the strategy level actually isn't so hard to justify for BTR in a place like London. It's more around execution. So how can you actually execute when the world is so volatile, where you don't really know what your build cost is going to be like because Iran might be bombed and the oil price might just go up so much? Like, how can you actually control execution? That's really the tough point. But I think that we're in operational real estate conference because at the end of the day, good operators and not so good operators, that's where the execution premium really differs. Sure. And for capital, ultimately, I think partnering up with the good operators who can mitigate risk, who think ahead, who tries to protect the capital from these unknown, unforeseeable mitigation risk as to the degree possible, I think will be the way to go about it.
Interesting point. Again, Helen, linking on that, how would you find a really good operator that can deliver those things?
Well, I think you take a good look at what's out there and you find an operator that aligns with you culturally and actually that you can work with, because like any business, when you're looking for an operator, there are no perfect operators. I can speak from experience, but actually finding an operator that will develop and work with you as your strategy will no doubt change is the most important thing from an operation perspective. I think just going back to Ashley's point, amenity for me is the place where I'm seeing the real kind of sharp end of the wedge. as things are getting tighter. It's been interesting. I've been working on some stabilised buildings, multifamily, that are sort of 6, 7, 8 years old. And looking at the difference in the amenity provision there compared to a new building is really stark. They're a lot bigger, a lot more space, less intimate. And we're starting to move towards what we're calling defined flexibility. So yes, we absolutely need flexible spaces, but the use of those spaces still has to be well defined in different ways. So maybe having an area that has a screening room, a clubhouse, space to do events, but it's quite clear within each of those areas the different uses you could use. And we're seeing more and more where we just provide a function room, that's not so useful, and that's not generating the usage from the residents that we would expect.
Okay, thank you. We've moved to 5 minutes to the end. So questions from the audience, please. We welcome them. Anyone got any questions for this panel? Sorry, the guy in the back in the grey jacket.
Hi there. In the student world, a lot of operators use net promoter scores. Are you seeing that across the build-to-rent space?
Yeah, I think we touched on home views as well, I think.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not seeing NPS in terms of that kind of pure measurement. No, not as much as perhaps I would expect to. I think Home Views has taken over the market in terms of getting that kind of live resident feedback. I'm looking with a client at the moment at a different kind of resident survey and resident engagement metric that does include NPS, so it's not unheard of, but I don't think it's being used to the extent and kind of to the level of consistency that it is across PBSA.
The only time I've heard it mentioned was Quintain. I remember Russell talking extensively about NPS, but I've not heard not much across
US
the market.
influence.
We use NPS at ARC, and if you were to ask me how you work out the equation, I know it's actually quite simple. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but we do include it in our quarterly surveys. And the benefit, obviously, is you can sort of look at other industries like hotel and see how it performs. So yeah, I think it's a worthwhile metric.
Yeah, same here. So we look at it as a metrics for us in terms of resident satisfaction.
I think it's really worthwhile, but I think that using the multiple data points is important. So we make sure that we get a kind of full view across the different ways that the residents can feed back to us.
Yeah. Thank you. There's a question down here somewhere. Yeah, sorry, the front, second row here.
Thanks. Jill, question for you, just in terms of the efficiencies you were talking about in your schemes in London. Are you, assuming you're having to build to space standards at kind of 50 square meters for a one bed, off the top of my head, how are you affording to build stuff at truly affordable price, affordable price point, given that you're having to build a 50 square meter one bed?
That's a great question.
Is there a magic wand that you can share with the audience?
I'd say the magic wand is looking for different possible uses, right? Because, I mean, sui generis co-living obviously does not require 50 square meter for the space. And, so what we look at is cross-planning use class. Because ultimately, for that middle sector, it's not for families, but a single person, do they really need 50 square meter, or would they prefer a 20 square meter well-designed space with access to co-workings and well-beings, blah. So really the answer to your question is it's very hard to do in the 50 square meter bucket. And that's why it has been a huge undersupply in the market. And so that the answer is you have to find other options to deliver it. Yes, is one of the options. We're not a planning use class specific. We look across the planning use class.
I have to say it's the fun question, Ian, but
You don't need it.
You can just
you
shout
can
it.
project.
Everybody's heard me earlier. I just wanted to tee up two things. There are a lot of hoteliers in the room. I know because I lost my argument to them. Sorry. There is an opportunity, I think, particularly in co-living, say, for the redevelopment of hotels in particular, because that's quite a good suited typology. And also maybe if you could touch on office to resi conversions, because again, that is a opportunity that I think we can take advantage of when we can't build new.
I can take this. So as the option of how to create supply. In London, I think you have to be really innovative. So office to office conversion is a route that we're doing. We're saying we have some assets in Zone 1. I mean, we never thought we'd be doing living, attainable living in Zone 1, but how can you do this? Now there's some absolutely in the office space that you could potentially turn into other use. But the challenge is it's actually so difficult to find the right office. It can't be too deep. It has to have the right windows. Cannot be too tall. Because otherwise you're going to gateway too. So there's so many nuances. But that's why I say kind of return is strategy plus execution. You kind of have to find the right thing. But yeah, hotel conversion is also something we look at. We haven't managed to find one, but you guys looked at it. So I mean, Charlie can speak to it.
Yeah, I mean, with ARC, that was kind of formed through a joint venture with Crosstree where we bought a hotel in Wembley. And that was somewhat unique in the sense that we bought it coming out of the pandemic, and it was a Singaporean investor that was quite nervous of operating a short stay model. Slightly ironically, sort of obviously that short stay went on performing well, but that we were sort of we bought that, we effectively agreed the deal prior to it being built, and we then took it on PC and kind of refurbished it. We have since really focused on trying to find sort of 3 to 4 star kind of rundown hotels in zones 2 to 4 that would work well for residential, and maybe occupancies have dipped, but they're quite hard to find. We've found, and particularly getting vacant possession. A lot of them are owned by family offices that like to trade between themselves, and I think that market's now also performing quite well. So yeah, it's certainly something that as a strategy we're focused on. I think also with the recent news around government contracts coming to an end, that could be quite an interesting opportunity area. I think just to finish on the office conversion opportunities, we've also kind of been really actively looking at that space and bidding on opportunities, but we've found it to be very overly saturated and competitive, particularly for where we're looking in London. Anything kind of sub 15 million mark, you've got a lot of players in that space that want to kind of get a flag in London, and I don't know how they're getting it to work. When we with our investors, we do very detailed kind of capex and cost assumptions prior to bidding on things, and I think there's a lot of people being very aggressive on what is actually going to be required to get these assets up to a certain standard.
Okay.
Sorry? Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I know we're going to wrap up now, but great questions from the audience, great commentary from the panel. Thanks for your participation, and thank you to the panel.